All right. So when we left off, when we left off in the first part of chapter 13, we talked about the two observations that Darwin made. One, come on, click. There you go. One, variation in traits. Two, most things die before they can pass those traits along. So those are the two observations. So what can we infer from those? What extension of those two observations can we make? Well, the first one is that individuals whose traits give them some type of advantage, so a higher probability of survival and reproduction, will tend to have more offspring than other individuals. This makes sense. Think about animals that are better camouflaged to hide from predators are going to be more likely to survive than animals that aren't camouflaged, for example. So this is his first kind of extension of his observation. The second one is that because of this unequal ability, because some individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce than others, that the ones that survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of those traits that are favorable to survival. So in other words, here we can see that if the yellow or whatever they are, beige beetles are better hidden than their green counterparts, then they're going to be more likely to survive and therefore reproduce. And when they reproduce, they're going to produce offspring that look like them. They're not going to necessarily produce as many green beetles because they themselves are brown. And we all understand inheritance because of Mendelian genetics. So this led to, so again, very straightforward, two observations and two extensions. And those simple observations and inferences led to this modern theory of evolution by natural selection. So we have kind of four major parts of this. We have overproduction. In other words, any population, most populations produce more individuals than can survive. All of those offspring have variations in traits. And there will be some selective process. Who's doing that selection? Well, it's nature. It's the animals that prey upon them. It's the conditions that they live in, the weather that they have to endure, the kind of water that they drink from, and the kind of plants that they might eat, and so on. So as that population progresses through time, and then they in turn have their own offspring, that ratio, that phenotype ratio, and that the allele frequency is going to change in that next generation. And that's called adaptation. So it's very important to understand that this happens in a population. This doesn't happen at the level of an individual. It only occurs if we have, whatever these are, elk or moose or something, right? It can only happen if we look at an entire herd of these animals. We can't look at a single animal and say evolution has occurred. So yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting at, right? Only populations can evolve. We can't look at one, let's just call this they kind of look like reindeer. Let's call them, I like reindeer. Okay. So we can't look at a single reindeer and say, we have a change in allele frequency. Excuse me. We've had a change in allele frequency in this one individual because remember, our genes don't change. Our genes were set in stone as soon as we were a zygote, way back when, and our genes are the same then, and they will always be the same. So the only time that genes get shuffled and allele frequency gets shuffled is when parents have offspring, and therefore in a population. So another important thing to point out about natural selection is that it can only increase or decrease the frequency of those heritable traits. So notice here, the trait that we're looking at, it looks kind of like fur color, for example, right? We have lighter colored reindeer, lighter colored reindeer and darker colored reindeer. And it looks like for whatever reason, the darker colored reindeer are more likely to survive in this particular environment. So the allele frequency probably changed. I mean, the phenotype frequency certainly changed because we have lots more brown, dark brown reindeer in our population compared to our original population. Notice though that it can't create new traits. So it can only select for traits that are already there. So we can't create something new from natural selection. We can only modify and the traits that were passed to us from our parents' parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and so on. So there's this idea of descent with modification, we call it. So as these populations kind of go through time, so we have offspring, and so on, there's going to be slight modifications made each time there's a mating process and offspring occurs that will, again, over time, change a population of animals. So we have this idea of fitness. And when you think of fitness, you think of maybe like an aerobics class or how much you can bench or something like that. But remember that fitness means something very different from a biologist. For a biologist, fitness simply means how likely is this particular animal, how likely is it to survive and pass on its traits to the next generation? So if we look at these two parrots, we can compare the fitness simply because this parrot had more offspring. It maybe survived longer, or it had a larger clutch of eggs, or it mated more often and therefore had more, what would be the, more rounds, right? It basically gave birth more times. So that leads to a higher fitness for this parrot compared to the parrot with lower fitness. So high fitness means better adapted or more adapted to the environment because they're surviving more and therefore reproducing more, surviving longer and therefore reproducing more. So let's look at this cartoon and ask yourself which of these are true. So let's think about the one that is definitely not true, and hopefully you see that that is D. D is not true. Working out does not change your genes. Your genes, like I mentioned in the previous slide, your genes were decided when you were a zygote, and that's it. So it might change the expression of those genes, but that's a very complicated topic. And when you take physiology, you'll see what I'm talking about there. But our genes don't change. So the genes that we pass along to our children aren't going to change either. They're just going to get shuffled up and mixed with our mate, and that will decide the traits that our offspring has. Excuse me. So, let's also get rid of B. Sure, our kids will benefit from our hard work. This, I don't know, that doesn't even mean anything. But I did want to point out A. Although A is also wrong, this is a good example of that Lamarckian, was it Lamarck? Yeah, Lamarck. The Lamarckian idea of evolution, that basically the traits that we acquire over our lifetime, like if we're really into physical fitness and we work out all the time and we're really in shape, that somehow that will affect the way that our children are, will somehow affect the genes that are passed on to our children. And that's simply not true. There's nothing that we can do that will change our genes. So the correct answer here is that our kids, in fact, could be couch potatoes. So we have no, and again, just based on our behavior now, there's nothing that we can really do in our behavior short of, I mean, I guess there's certainly things we could do. For example, there are chemicals that are they're called teratogens. They're mutagens that would actually mutate if you're female, they could mutate the genes that are in your eggs and cause birth defects or chromosomal abnormalities. But we're just talking about, again, just kind of straightforward mating and offspring. For women, our eggs were determined. Gosh, are they at birth? I want to say that our ovaries have all the eggs in them at birth. And of course, men, they produce sperm pretty much every day. But the genes that are going into that sperm are always the same, right? You don't all of a sudden get different genes just because you're working out. It doesn't work that way. All right, so if we think about this, if all of the, here we have horses, if all the horses were this chestnut color, really dark brown, that couldn't be a selective factor because they're all the same. So we have to have variation in these traits in order for evolution to occur. And the only way to do that is there's two ways to create a new, how should I say this? There's only two ways to modify genetic variation. And the first one is really, the first one is, in my opinion, is really the only one. And that probably is because I'm a bacteriologist and I don't understand sexual reproduction as well as I should, I guess. But really the only way to change our DNA is through mutation. So that mutation occurs, we substitute an A nucleotide for a T or a C for a G, and that's going to create, I think we have it in this. Okay. I'll talk about it then in a minute. So mutation is really, to me, is the only way. But then, of course, we can change we can vary which genes pass on through sexual reproduction. So in other words, if person A mates with person B, they're going to have a genetic variation when compared to a person A mating with person C, right? So depending on who your choice of mate is, your offspring will have variation in those genes. So the last half of this talk, we're going to talk about the 5 major mechanisms of evolution that can change. Remember, evolution, very simple definition: change in allele frequency in a population over time. So as I mentioned before, mutation is really the only kind of bona fide way of creating new genetic variation. And again, here's just a nice example of how this works. Remember that DNA is made into messenger RNA through transcription. Messenger RNA is translated to these amino acid sequences that make up all of our proteins. When we change that nucleotide sequence from a T to an A, that creates a mutation, and that's going to change the amino acids that make up that protein. And I just said when we change, we don't change it, right? This is a mistake. It happens on accident. And this is also very, very rare. And of course, because it happens on accident, it's random. We can't mutate things by design. There's no way to really do that, certainly short of really, really high tech I'm sure many of you have heard of CRISPR technology, right? It's a way to go in and change genes that you want, and those trials are just now starting in humans. There's a couple of clinical trials that were unfortunately probably put on hold because of the coronavirus situation. But mutations, really, the thing that you should remember, again, it's the only true source of new genetic coding. And it's very rare, and of course it's random. So for example, we have a human genome has about 3 billion base pairs. So that's kind of weird to think about. Every single cell in your body has 3 billion base pair long sequence of DNA in it. And if we have a mutation that happens every great once in a while, it's only going to change one of those nucleotides, one of those 3 billion nucleotides. So the chances of it actually doing something that makes a difference is really small, and that that change probably is insignificant. It's not going to have any real phenotypic. It's not going to have any kind of real phenotypic effect. So it's only over really, really long periods of time that mutation leads to the accumulation of new genetic variation. So this is why evolution happens so incredibly slow, because ultimately it's about mutations. Now, those mutations will lead to variations in traits. Right, so the mutations will accumulate over long periods of time, and pretty soon all of our little circles, let's say, right, they're going to have variation in their color. We have orange and red and yellow and so on. And so when they mate with one another, the allele frequency is going to determine what color, what trait they ultimately have. And it looks like here nature is selecting for the darker red circles. So maybe the darker red circles are better camouflaged for whatever reason, from predation, for example. And of course, because these 2 circles are the only circles left on the planet, they're going to mate and have offspring. And you can see that that final offspring will be red, because we had 2 red colored parents. Oh, it looks like we were looking at some type of resistance level. Whatever, doesn't matter. Just ignore this at the bottom. All right, so it's important also to point out that, again, mutations, totally random. We have no real way of predicting what base pair, what A, T, C, or G is going to change. And it's really rare, and it's random. We can't control it. But and we personally can't control natural selection either, but remember, it's nature that's controlling it. It's nature that is determining the fitness of that particular species to survive. So let's think about adaptation, this term, and ask yourself which of these statements is true. So these two statements both kind of more or less say the same thing, and they're using the term adaptation or adapt, much like we all do in normal conversation. When you think about how you can adapt, if it's a really, like this coming week, it's supposed to be really warm outside in San Diego, and you'll see, it'll feel really warm at first, but you'll adapt to it in a few days and it'll become kind of normal for you, right? So that the word adapt means something very different to common everyday language versus biologists, right? We have, that term is very different. So these are both incorrect. We're not talking about how individuals can adapt to a given situation. And also, adaptation has nothing to do with intelligence. It simply has to do with the ability of a population to adapt to its environment. So, and again, this is going to take many, and when we say many years, we're not talking about 100 years. We're talking about tens of thousands of years, millennia, millions of years, and so on. So this is the correct answer here. Yet another phone call. Let me come right back to you guys. Let me pause this really quick. There it is. Okay, another thing to think about with natural selection is that it's really only working, or it's acting upon, the phenotype of individuals within a population. So we see a perfect example of that here. The hawk, or whatever this bird of prey is selecting for, or I shouldn't say that, it's finding the light colored mice easier than the darker colored mice, because the darker colored mice are well camouflaged compared to their white, lighter colored counterpart. So these lighter colored mice stick out and therefore are more susceptible to predation. So this bird that nature, right, and is being manifested in this bird right now, is selecting for the phenotype of dark, right, of darker fur color. And so when this population mates and has the next round of offspring, there will be more gray mice that survive and more gray mice that survive and fewer lighter colored mice, and therefore their offspring are more likely to have that gray phenotype. So because phenotype is tied to our genotype, the gene pool will be altered, right? It's more likely that we're going to see more gray colored alleles than the lighter colored alleles in this case. All right. So when we talk about natural selection has three different kind of, how should I say, there's three patterns or three manifestations of natural selection. So if we think about the mouse population, we can have a range of fur color. This is the phenotype, and therefore that will affect the gene pool of these mice. And we can have three different situations occur. Let's say that all of these mice live in an area where that middle, kind of that mid-gray color is the predominant fauna color. In other words, this gray color is really well camouflaged compared to either extreme, compared to the white mouse or the dark mouse. So this pattern of natural selection is going to select for the mice that are kind of in the middle of this distribution. This is called stabilizing selection. We're going to see both the lighter colored mice and the darker colored mice get selected, probably from predation, and be removed from the gene pool. So this is called a stabilizing selection. But now let's imagine that these mice find themselves in an area where the background or the area that they're living in is darker. Now they're going to undergo directional selection. In other words, the environment is selecting for mice that have darker fur color. And we actually see this. The pocket mouse, the pocket mouse video that you do for, I think it's Lab 13, talks about the pocket mice that live on sand versus the lava flat. So it's a really cool little story there. And actually, that's a really good example of disruptive selection. So what is the area? I forget the area of New Mexico where they actually did the study. You'll see it in the video, but there's lava flats that are dark. So the background, right, the rocks and the soil is very dark where some of the mice live. Whereas in other areas, the sand is the predominant, like the lighter color, kind of beige brown sand is the predominant background color. And so in that situation, we would actually see disruptive selection occur. So mice that live predominantly in the lighter, kind of the lighter background areas will be selecting for the lighter colored fur, whereas the mice that live in the darker lava flats will be selected for their darker colored fur. So 3 different patterns. We have stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. All right, I want to briefly mention a variation on natural selection called artificial selection. And this is selection where the environment or nature isn't doing the selection, but humans are. This is what we do when we breed tomatoes. When I lived in the Midwest, I would always save my favorite tomatoes and grow my next year's tomatoes based on the seeds that I had saved from the previous year. And that's kind of a method of artificial selection. I'm saying this was the tastiest tomato, so I'm going to take the seeds of that tomato and pass along those genes. So I was doing the selection in that case. People who breed dogs, for example, right, a very big industry, horse breeding and so on. Those are all examples of artificial selection because the humans are doing the selecting of who is going to mate and have offspring, not nature. Another good example of this is pesticide application. This is why it's such a controversial topic, because pesticides they're basically always doomed to fail because as soon as you apply a pesticide, it's going to kill the vast majority of those insects. But the survivors that have been able to withstand that pesticide application have something in their DNA. There's some quality that those bugs have that allowed them to survive that pesticide application. So of course, they're the ones that are going to survive and pass on their traits to that next generation. So now what happens is that following generation is going to get more and more resistant to that pesticide application. So you'll often see, if you, again, big topic in the Midwest. I was probably here too in the Central Valley, right, in the more agrarian areas of California. But the pesticide rotation and the way that you apply pesticides and how much you apply is a very, very important skill for farmers to have, because it can really, a bad decision on pesticide application can ruin your crop, because you're basically selecting for these mutant insects that are resistant to all the chemicals that you're throwing at them. Okay. So another kind of concept that gets at some misconceptions with evolution. What happens when body parts aren't used? Well, remember that our phenotype, in this case wings, is dependent on our genes. So the only way that we don't have flamingos, the only way that a flamingo's wings will change is if its genes change. So sure, an individual flamingo's wings could atrophy if they're not using them, but that's not changing the allele frequency in a population. And because we're not selecting for flamingos that have strong wing function, we have no selective effect on those subsequent generations. All right, let's go to our next mechanism of change in allele frequency in a population over time, and that's genetic drift. So genetic drift can change from generation to generation based on random circumstances. So this is probably one of the major mechanisms of allele frequency change, and it plays a much larger role than I think scientists realized now that we're able to do kind of computational analysis and work with really large data sets. There's a clearer picture of this idea that genetic drift plays a pretty large role in allele change frequency. So let's imagine that we have a population of plants that produce these flowers. Whoops, sorry. And of these, and let's just assume that pollination here is random. The wind is going to carry pollen from one flower to the next, or maybe it's bees that don't really have a preference for flower color, right? So it just, these particular flowers are going to get selected randomly to have their pollen get carried to the next flower, and their offspring look like this. And now just randomly these two are going to be the two that their pollen just happened to, get carried to the next flower. And now we have a dramatic change in allele frequency based on really random events, right? Again, we're assuming that there's no, how would I say, excuse me, no selective process here, that the wind is just kind of carrying pollen from one flower to the next by chance. Now, there's two different kinds, there's two variations or special types of genetic drift that I want to talk about. The first one is founder effect. And founder effect works on when a population has, a population has become separated from another population. And therefore, that new population, that founder population, are going to be different. So we can see here we have this original population of butterflies. Somehow a few of those butterflies got to an island. So a storm carried them, or they got on a boat, like they kind of settled onto a ship or a boat and took a nap, and they woke up in in a different island. And now these three butterflies are the original founder colony of this new island. And you can see that the allele frequency, or the phenotype frequency, I should say, of these three butterflies are very different from these. First of all, we see no white butterflies. We only see two black butterflies and an orange one. And so that's going to change the allele frequency in that population. This is called founder effect. The other type of genetic drift is called the genetic bottleneck. And this happens when we have a massive reduction in population size. And again, due to random reasons. So we have a sudden change in the environment. The vast majority of the population dies out. A perfect example here is hunting of seals, or hunting in Unit 5. You're going to look at how the wolf population in the West was decimated by hunters. And so we had this massive hunting pressure on bison, on wolves, and then in Canada on seals. And so they were hunted. Otters is another good example, right? We used to have, wouldn't it be amazing to have otters in San Diego? I think that'd be so cool. So we used to have otters in San Diego, right? But they were basically extirpated from the area due to hunting. So there's several indigenous species in North America that were wiped out as soon as the colonists came over and basically killed everything they could get their hands on. And one of them is seals. So the seal population was reduced to a fraction. I mean, I think it was like less than 5% of its original number. And so you can imagine that this reduction changed the allele frequency. Here you can see that there were, it looks like about 4 different kind of colors of seals. And because that population was reduced by so much, we actually changed that allele frequency in that population. So we have a new allele frequency based on that huge reduction in the population. So this is called bottleneck. So it seems to work if we have a really big population of animals, so really big number. It's the effect is not as great. How am I trying to say this? Let's imagine that we had 10. Let's go back to our example, right? So here we have how many butterflies? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh my gosh, I can't count. 8, 10, 11, 13, looks like 17. So there were 20, right? So if we count up all the butterflies, there were 20 butterflies on this island, and 3 of them got away. So that would be 3, that's 15%. 15% of the butterflies went from this island to this island. So, but imagine now that there were, instead of 20, let's imagine that there were 20,000, right? And so still only 15% came over, but now we have 3,000 butterflies that made it over. That's those 3,000 butterflies. We're more than likely going to have a good representative example of all the different phenotypes that could occur. So I guess what I'm trying to get across here is that in genetic drift, both in founder effect and bottleneck effect, they have a really big effect on small populations. So in animal species that have huge numbers and have really high reproductive rates, genetic drift isn't as significant. So also I want to stress that genetic drift is random. So there's unlike natural selection, right, which is directed for survival to fit into that particular environment, the butterflies that got over to this island were random. There was no selection process here. The seals that weren't hunted, I mean, more or less, right, there was a random selective process. They were just, the seals that were killed were just really unlucky seals. So, and also the last point, and this is going to become more important in the next slide, genetic drift leads to loss of genetic variation. There's not as much genetic variation here. Here we see 3 different phenotypes of wing color. Here we only see 2. Here we see about 4 or 5 different colors of seals. After that bottleneck, we only see 2. So we have a loss in genetic variation over time as a result of genetic drift. Now, on the other hand, we have gene flow. So gene flow is, I always think about it as the opposite of genetic drift. It's not exactly, but let me explain it and then I'll talk about it a little bit. So gene flow is the movement. If we had 2 populations of animals and they suddenly were allowed to intermix, that would be considered gene flow. And so it's going to be, so those genes will be transferred from the movement of fertile individuals. So we have, it looks like a doe, right? Doe from this population will move through the mountain pass and probably mate with a male, a buck, right? A male reindeer is a buck, I'm sure, over here. And so we're having literally a flow of genes from one area to another. This can, of course, happen with plants as well through pollen movement, right? The pollen, as long as the pollen can be carried by wind. And did you know, and yet another cool thing, like pollen can get from like Africa to the eastern seaboard of the United States. Like pollen is crazy light and it can be carried by wind currents pretty dang far. So we can have pretty large areas of gene flow as long as there are species within that area. So gene flow, I guess this is what I meant in terms of how it's opposite to genetic. Genetic drift tends to make populations more genetically diverse. I'm not using the right word. A loss of genetic variation. So genetic drift leads to a loss of genetic variation, whereas gene flow tends to make a population more genetically similar. So we're working within one population, and over time, gene flow will make that population more genetically homogeneous. And if we interrupt that population, then we actually have in the way that I see it, we almost have a genetic drift situation. We have 2 lineages starting to occur where, like, so if we were to cut off, like, let's say that there was like a mountain range that formed between these 2 populations, this population, population 1 would have this set of alleles and population 2 would now have this set of alleles. So once gene flow stops, these 2 populations are going to start to look genetically different from one another, whereas gene flow allows them to look more similar. All right, I think this is the last one. Our last mechanism of evolution is non-random mating. In other words, so think about our flower example back here. The wind carried the pollen from flower to flower. It was random, but of course, in many mating situations, that mating is not random. Hopefully, anyway, it's on purpose. It's non-random. And this is called sexual selection. And again, this has nothing to do with adaptive evolution. It doesn't necessarily make their offspring more fit. It just simply has to do with the fact that mates have a choice. and they could select a mate based on preference, and that will lead to a change in allele frequency over time. So I think this is our last kind of concept question here. We have our Industrial Revolution, and the moth population changed. So in 1850, so early in the Industrial Revolution, we had these moths that kind of looked like this. They were lighter colored and they had black speckles on them because they blended in with this tree that had a very similar coloration. So after 50 years, there were a lot of soot accumulation, and the trees got darker because of these, basically because of pollution deposits and soot deposits. And within 50 years, we saw that the predominant species of these pepper moths were black. So what is the most likely explanation? So of course this is possible, I guess. So it could land on a butterfly and make it darker, or the moth, I'm sorry, could make it darker, but that's not going to lead to a change in allele frequency. And remember that evolution or change in allele frequency has nothing to do with need. That moth could want to get darker all at once, and it's not going to happen. So just because the moths want to get darker or need to get darker doesn't mean it's going to happen. We know that the environment selected for darker colored moths. So they survived because they were better camouflaged, because the trees are darker now versus 50 years ago. And so the environment selected for darker colored moths, those moths survived, and they passed those traits along to their offspring. So wow, that was fast. So that does it for chapter 13. Everything that we've talked about here is called, another term for it is microevolution. And in other words, how does a population, we talked about pepper moths, we talked about flowers and seals and butterflies, how can their traits change over time? And again, that's called evolution by natural selection. And we know that the 5 major mechanisms are mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and sexual selection. These are the 5 mechanisms that can cause a pool of alleles, a gene pool, to change from one generation to the next. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how these changes over really long periods of time can lead to speciation. In other words, how do new species arrive, and how did we actually get to the diversity that exists today on our planet?